Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third event of our webinar series on the impact of Korean popular culture on North America. My name is Seung-Kyung Kim. I am Korea Foundation Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Director of the Institute for Korean Studies at Indiana University. The Embassy of the Republic of Korea in the USA and Indiana University Bloomington are co-hosting the webinar series on this timely and important topic. Our first webinar featuring Dr. Sira Balseji was a huge success with over 900 people viewing the event. Dr. Seji's talk introduced important questions such as what is Korean popular music and how is it different from American popular culture? And how does it continue to attract new audiences despite linguistic barriers? The second webinar featuring Dr. Candace Apps Robertson attracted more than 1,000 viewers for her talk, BTS and ARMY, a synergistic experience in transcultural fandom. Her talk discussed questions such as who makes up the ARMY community and how does the experience of being in a transcultural fandom provide possibility for intercultural exchange. As in the first webinar, the audience involvement in the Q&A was impressive. If anyone missed either the first or second webinars, they are now on YouTube. You can find them by simply searching YouTube for the impact of Korean popular culture on North America. As I said previously, the 4 lectures in this series introduce Korean popular music, literature, film, and TV dramas, and explain how Americans are learning to appreciate these vibrant forms of Korean popular culture. Taken together, they provide an in-depth orientation for those interested in understanding this fascinating cultural phenomenon. As of now, we have over 600 people registered for tonight's lecture by Dr. Jenny Wang Medina, and I hope that all of you join our final webinar featuring Michelle Cho speaking about Kdramas at 8:30 p.m. on November 19th. Now I will turn to Dr. Susan Huang, who will moderate tonight's event.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Huang, and I am an assistant professor of Korean literature and cultural studies in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Indiana University. I will be moderating tonight's session and the Q&A following tonight's presentation. We anticipate an exciting hour and a half ahead of us. At any point during the presentation and the Q&A that will follow, please use the Q&A tool in Zoom to submit your questions for our speaker. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Jenny Wang Medina. Dr. Wang Medina is an assistant professor of modern and contemporary Korean literature, visual media, and culture at Emory University. Her research focuses on issues of national and global cultures, diaspora, multiculturalism, canon formation, and translation in Korean literature, film, and popular culture. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jenny Wang Medina.
Thank you, Professor Huang, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to just set this up. Okay. So I'd like to thank Professor Kim, the Indiana University Institute for Korean Studies, and the Embassy of the Republic of Korea in the USA for inviting me to be part of this webinar series. I'm honored to be included with such a fantastic group of scholars of contemporary Korean culture. And I must say, with all the opportunities this fall to virtually attend events at universities all over the world, I think I've learned more about BTS and K-pop than I ever could have imagined. Clearly, the impact of Korean popular culture around the world has been truly tremendous in the last decade. Something I think is especially evident in the enormous growth of Korean studies around the world. So I should probably say thank you to also K-pop, BTS, K-drama, and all you stands out there for keeping me in a job. So to get a little serious, my talk is going to be a bit of a departure from the others in this series that really have dealt with extremely popular culture like K-pop and K-drama. Tonight, or today for some of you, I'll be talking about Korean literature and cinema, mostly literature, and the question of so-called global high culture. So what does this mean? To put it very bluntly, it's this question I'm going to be talking about of whether Korean culture has made it as an elite world culture. When director Bong Joon-ho's film Parasite won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, he remarked, "Screenwriting is a very solitary and lonely process. You don't write a screenplay to represent your country, but this is the very first Oscar to South Korea." Bong's collaborator Han Jin-won added that just as the US has Hollywood, Korea has Chungmuro. I would like to thank all the filmmakers and storytellers of Chungmuro from the bottom of my heart. Bong and Han's triumphant remarks encapsulate the complex identifications of nation, individual, and affective community that tells the story of South Korea's decades-long project to gain global cultural recognition. In a word, South Korean film, and by extension, its culture, had finally made it into the elite strata of international cultural influence. Or has it? Rewind to 2016, when novelist Han Gang won the Man Booker International Prize. Korean literature was seen to have finally made it. That's the vegetarian here, and these are all of the, or this is a sampling of the international covers. Or we can go back to 2012, when Korean-American chef Hooni Kim's fine dining establishment Danji in New York City became the first Korean restaurant to earn a Michelin star, and Korean cuisine had, quote, finally made it. These moments mark important milestones in the recognition of Korean culture as global culture, or global high culture, or as a national culture with distinction. A culture that produces auteur film versus movies, world literature versus foreign literature, or cuisine versus ethnic food. If Korea hadn't won these prizes, would it still have a high culture, as far as the world is concerned? Until the 21st century, recognition of Korea's cultural achievements outside the country were limited to small rooms of pre-modern artifacts or exhibitions of traditional lifestyles in ethnographic collections. K-pop and K-drama aside, how did South Korea achieve cultural distinction? And what does it mean for a national culture to gain distinction? So this is the subject of my current book project, the title of which, the current title, which you can see here, Constructing K-Culture, South Korea's Quest for Cultural Distinction. In the book, I talk about literature, food, and I also touch on food and K-dramas. Tonight, however, I'd like to discuss this in terms of the push for literary translation and international recognition of Korean cinema, because while we all know how important Korean popular culture is, it's difficult to say whether a culture has really made it or received the highest cultural recognition without literature, auteur film, and the fine arts. I'm a specialist in one or two of these, so I'll just focus on those. You can join these series again in a couple of weeks for Dr. Michelle Cho's take on K-dramas. As Korean popular culture began to gain traction, first in East Asia, then around the world through film, pop music, food trends, and dramas, the branded approach of K-culture became the go-to designation to draw productive comparisons to different aspects of Korean culture. I borrowed these images here a few years ago from, I believe, our hosts, the Ministry of Culture, Sports, and Tourism. It's a series of books about K culture in several different languages that was published by the Korea Culture and Information Service from 2011 to 2014. So I thank our hosts for those. They illustrate my point very nicely. In addition to music, fashion, art, architecture, food, television, sports, and beauty, South Korea has also invested heavily in literary translation in the last 2 decades as part of the efforts to globalize Korean culture. We've seen the success in this approach in that the K designation, K, is now an easily recognizable prefix for pretty much anything related to Korea. If any of my students have joined us, they can probably tell you how much I like to talk about K pairs. This is one of my favorite K things. When I started seeing it in the grocery store, I was thrilled because I thought it was so cute. And I also love Korean parents. But for most Americans prior to the 2000s, K-something would most likely be completed with Mart, as in the Kmart superstores. But we all know now that this has really changed. All of this is to say that the image of Korea has undergone a major sea change over the past 20 or 30 years. And this change has occurred in dialogue with multiple claims to representing Korea in international media, from South Korea, from different sites of the Korean diaspora, and from North Korea. But the now ubiquitous K-designation to denote anything culturally Korean is really tied to the understanding that all of these K things can best be found in South Korea. I'm gonna go back a little bit in time. So what Korea used to look like, or used to have what the image might have looked like before the 2000s or before K. In the 20th century, I think the image of Korea was a fairly static image of a patriarchal society with women in traditional dress and usually uniformed, quiet, hardworking students in uniforms. I said that, or even as a sort of ambiguous other Asian country that's considered in comparison to China or Japan. You can see here, this is an album cover from a German LP of authentic Korean music that shows different scenes showing traditional Korea and a kind of modified version of a modern pastoral Korea. So you see like the woman in the hanbok and the dancing and the architecture. I don't know if I can make the slides bigger, I'm sorry. I don't believe so, but please bear with me. So my image of Korea, and I use the imagined Korea because as a nod kind of to the current Imagine Your Korea campaign. So my image as a Korean American growing up in the 1970s and 80s were these grainy shots from television news of the democratization movement, especially of the 1988 Seoul Olympics. I have a lot of swag from that, which is justified with some sort of idealized image of traditional culture received from within, that I got from within the Korean American community in my hometown or from the media. The 1988 Seoul Olympics was another moment of South Korea's making it that showed the world this exemplary developing country. I still remember the Taekwondo demonstration from the opening ceremony. It was this huge choreographed performance of young students doing Taekwondo. But that's not really the thing that made me really remember it. This was rather the NBC color commentary for the US broadcast that really got me. Brian Gumbel at the time had marveled at these students' skill, but then as they ran off the field, picking up the boards that they had broken during the routine, he remarked that, wasn't it marvelous that these students were so obedient and well-trained? And could you imagine American kids cleaning up after themselves like that? I know it was an off-color joke, but as a Korean American kid, I did not appreciate the comparison, which sounded a little bit too much like what my parents were saying about how Americanized I was or something. The most dramatic shift in the understanding of culture in South Korea was the move, though, from culture as tradition to culture as a dynamic industry, or as a dynamic and forward-looking industry at the turn of the millennium. Once associated with orientalized images of patriarchy or kind of backwardness and political isolation as the Hermit Kingdom, or through images of the Korean War, Korean culture was now beginning to be conceived as a future-oriented and progressive culture of innovation. But what's very interesting is that Korea also successfully reconfigured its ethnic or orientalized traditional image into a highly aestheticized and desirable cultural past. You can see this here. These are images from the actual Imagine Your Korea campaign. So we have like the K-pop stuff and the shopping, and we have the palace with people in period costumes. Even these K-pop, I don't remember who this is. I apologize, but they're kind of standing in front of a very Korean looking building here. This too, I mean, who doesn't want to visit this romanticized Joseon, this historical K-dramas these days? This isn't a film, a photo I took at Gyeongbok Palace of tourists dressed up in hanbok and kind of strolling around. So Korea's move towards the cultural industries in the late 1990s was a clear indicator of the country's intention to shed its developmental image and engage Korean culture at the level of the big producers of cultural goods. Excuse me. And it has been one of the very few cases in which this move has been successful. This success was uneven, however, with music, television, and fashion moving more quickly than the effort to gain footing in the high culture arenas of literature and cinema, which have historically been pretty tightly guarded by the necessity for effective translation and recognition by international prize committees. So again, what I'd like to talk about today is how the changing perception of Korean culture has affected the field of Korean literature and film through translation and through dedicated exposure. And this will be my somewhat roundabout way of getting back to this question of the importance of literature and film in gauging global cultural influence. I should probably add here that I hope I'm not being delusional in saying that literature and auteur film are still important and still have the authority to speak as representative high culture forms of an ethnic or a national culture. But I think that the concentrated efforts that we've seen from not just Korea, but other countries into making literature and film visible in the world really does say something, this kind of competitive urge to, I don't know, win at the arts. Oops. Okay, so there are three major support organizations for the promotion of Korean literature abroad. There's the KLTI, the Korean Literature Translation Institute, which I think is now called LTI Korea. This is a government agency. There's the Daesan Foundation, which is a private foundation funded by Gyobo Life Insurance and Gyobo Books, and the International Communication Foundation, also a private organization funded by YBM CISA, English Language Academies, and the Dictionary. I should also include this disclaimer that I have been the very grateful recipient of a lot of support from these organizations for my research and for translations I've done. So up until the mid to late 1990s, when these organizations really became extremely active, most translations from Korea were done through UNESCO support for academic use or for the purposes of, quote, preservation of tradition. Many anthologies of what had become the national Korean canon were published and then went straight into university libraries without seeing much circulation outside of Korean studies courses. But since the mid to late 90s, there has been excellent governmental and private financial and bureaucratic support for literary translation. And these efforts to promote Korean literature internationally have had their ups and downs. But in the effort to expand the availability of Korean literature and art films, it's become clear that the responsibility of cultural producers to represent something authentic about Korean culture has also been placed on these, not only on Korean artists, but also on identifiable groups of ethnic Koreans pretty much anywhere in the world. I think this is a question of accessibility as much as anything else. As international news and cultural sources satisfy their curiosity about the Korean Peninsula and Korean immigrants the world over through whichever sources are responsive enough to their requests. Obviously, this is most likely to be South Koreans and Korean Americans, however, who themselves have different perspectives on the culture based on decades of geographic separation and changing, but still disparate cultural access. But what does this have to do with Korean literature and film gaining visibility in the world? I will say, well, during the boom of 1990s so-called ethnic literature in the US, Korean American writers were also charged with the task of explaining Korea to the world. This, in their own personal experiences with Korean emigre culture, they sometimes did and sometimes didn't. But to judge some books by their covers, something I really like to do, as you'll see as I go on, you can see the prevalence of a certain type of image of Korea. You see these students, the foreign student, you see this thing about language, you see like hanboks, of course, and like yellowness, I guess. But even as these authors, and these are all Korean American authors, they became talked about as representative Korean authors in English language literature. I think we should ask, are they writing Korean literature? The same can be said for ethnic Koreans who are writing and living abroad or living all over the world, in Japan, Germany, Russia, China. Many of these people not from South Korea or North Korea. This is a difficult question that is made even trickier by the increasingly fluid transnational Korean diaspora, as well as the ready availability of cultural content from pretty much anywhere. And also Koreans are everywhere. But now it's not uncommon to see best-selling Korean authors sharing space on prominent display tables or top-line recommendations for streaming services around the world. What changed, we might ask, and why did the world finally start to pay attention? I would say that the success or the relative success of Korean literature and film in the past 20 years is not solely due to the popularity of K-pop. Rather, Korea has engaged in a concerted effort to engage international high culture, as I've been saying, or what we might call world literature or global cinema through several different things. First, I talked about the exposure through the diaspora. They've also had a lot of financial support for restorations of film, through translations, through funding education for translators. There has been a lot of targeted participation at international events. There's also been hosting of international events, which brings the international arts community to Korea and really inculcates this kind of interest in what Korea is producing. It's also mad fun in Korea, so bringing people there is a great way to kind of encourage an affective identification with this place and a desire to kind of share this experience. There have also been several global education initiatives that have brought international scholars to teach at Korean universities. I was very impressed that South Korea actually managed to have 3 Nobel laureates, Nobel Prize in literature winners, come to Korea and speak, and then some of them to teach at Korean universities before they won the Nobel Prize. So they're very savvy. They have been very savvy about paying attention to the world literature scene. And I would say for film in particular, there are a lot of film festivals, international film festivals inside and outside of Korea that Korea has participated in, but also that bring filmmakers into Korea and also kind of spread this messaging. Finally, of course, there's the Korean Film Archive, which if you like Korean film, I'm sure you're familiar with this, which has been such a godsend for anyone teaching Korean film. And has really become an important source. So I would say that by doing this, they have made Korean arts active players on the world stage. But on the other hand, I might ask myself again if I'm delusional because I pay attention to this all the time. So this was something I was asking myself as I prepared this talk. because I realized I live in a very well cushioned bubble of knowing about Koreanness, is what I call it. Or I often tell people that what I do is I am a professional Korean. But these are some of the questions that I ask myself while thinking about this. First, has Korean literature and film really become as recognized as I think it has? Is it just my personal search algorithms? Because certainly the computer brains know what I want to see, and my news alerts make me think that, of course, everyone's talking about this. So then I also had to ask, do Korean people know really what has gone into making these cultural products successful? I thought to ask some people, do they know about what the LTI Korea is, or what on any of these initiatives that the government has done to promote Korean arts outside? Do they know about these things? I'm not sure that they do, but most people I know have already heard me talk, so I can't get a straight answer on that right now. But I would say too, visibility is one thing, but recognition is quite another. Gaining recognition required accurate transmission of the complexity of Korean arts, and this could only be achieved through highly skilled translation and exposure. There are complications of that exposure, however, which we can see here. Oops, where am I? We can see back here with there are these two lists that I just found kind of randomly that are of Korean novels you should know. On the left, you have this thing, it's from a blog called Bamboo Traveler. I think it's someone who had lived in Korea or something. And it's 15 books to spark your wanderlust about Korea. If you look at these books, we have only 3 that were actually written in Korean by South Korean nationals. Kim Ji-young, born 1982, Shin Kyung-suk's Please Look After Mom, and Han Gang's The Vegetarian. The rest of these are written by transnational Koreans or Korean Americans in English. Although this side doesn't make a distinction saying that they are books, that they are actual Korean literature. But on the right side, we have an article from Vanity Fair in November 2015 that says 5 Korean novels you should read now. Again, 2 of them are Korean, were originally published in South Korea in the Korean language and then were translated. But these 3 are not. They were published in the US and they're by Korean American writers. So yes, I do think it's more visible, and Korean culture is certainly having a moment right now. But I think we should also ask ourselves, what is this thing that we're calling Korean arts? And then why it matters too to have it be so visible, or why it matters that Han Gang won the Man Booker Prize, or that Bong Joon-ho won this clutch of Oscars. I would say too, South Korea's desire for this Nobel Prize, for the Nobel Prize in Literature is really it's not a big secret. This need for recognition bestowed on Korean literature by the prize or by any of these prizes have been the first topic of discussion whenever questions about Korean literature in the international arena arise. The second most asked question I got when I was in the early 2000s when I was translating was, who is the Korean Haruki Murakami? And I believe there have been several, but really there aren't any because they are Korean authors, not Haruki Murakami. I would say too that the Nobel is an inherently problematic prize in that it purports to be anti-nationalist and apolitical in its search for authors who are supposed to transcend national specificity in their expression of some supposed universal human condition. More often than not, however, authors from the so-called center languages and cultures are rewarded for their expression of universal conditions. Lately, this is more like the disillusionment with modern life, the discovery of some authenticity somewhere else, and authors from the so-called periphery languages or minority languages are rewarded for their expressions of difference, especially under political oppression, personal duress, or in conflict zones. So I'd like to go back to LTI Korea, or the Korean Literature Translation Institute. In 1996, this was started in 1996 with 100 trillion won, which is approximately 10 million US dollars, that had been set aside for something called the Korean Literature Translation Fund. And it was part of a 10-year focus on the celebration of the past of Korean arts and their development into what was called representative industries for the 21st century. This fund then becomes the LTI Korea in 2001, and their stated mission is to, and I'm quoting this, under the banner of globalizing Korean literature, canonize Korean literature with the goal of inclusion in mainstream world literature. This direct statement of the intention to send Korean literature out into the world tells us at least three things. First, that the parameters of national literature were considered fluid enough to fit into mainstream world literature. Two, that the government deemed Korean literature to be outside of the mainstream. And three, that the policy related to literature accepted the idea of a definitive world literature, to which it hoped to gain acceptance. I should also note that South Korea is not the only so-called minority literature to invest in the promotion of its literature abroad. I think, in fact, the LTI Korea has inspired some other countries, and perhaps this was a trend that was on its way, but several minority language countries in the 2000s have instituted these literature institutes that for outward bound translation, including Poland, Switzerland, Finland, and Egypt recently. That these moves are happening as the publishing industry bemoans decreases in readership and book sales really begs the question, why now? That is, why, as literary fiction becomes an increasingly rarefied and devalued commodity, are countries fighting to enter foreign literary markets, or at least get recognized there? By contrast, we have these things in organizations in center language countries like the Arts Council England or like the NEA that provide support for inbound translation in order to, what they say, and develop and invest in artistic and cultural experiences that enrich people's lives in England. This is from the Arts Council England website. These examples of the concern over transnational literary exchange from center and periphery or minority languages express literature's importance as a form of cultural capital that remains strongly national, but that also emphasizes the plurality of cultures within one state and a renewed recognition of the cultural legacies of imperialism in the face of Anglophone cultural domination. The desire for cultural recognition through language, literature, arts, and film is further supported by national culture in other national cultural institutes like the Cervantes Institute in Spain or the Alliance Française in France, the Japan Foundation, of course, the Korea Foundation, which provide this kind of financial and institutional support for language and cultural education and also scholarly research. But to go back to this idea of world cultures, I would say that the demands on Korean literature and film in the arena of world culture, world literature, and global film are several and contradictory. Because of the limited access to North Korea, South Korean arts are expected to speak for both. They should include pre-modern, so-called traditional culture, while also marveling at the advances achieved in the last 40 years. They should show women struggling against an oppressive patriarchy, which is inevitably included as criteria for any foreign or non-Western literature, it seems. And it should also be easily relatable to its closest neighbor countries, Japan, China, and more recently Vietnam, like I said, with Finding Korea's Murakami, while simultaneously explaining how it is different and particular. So Korean film, especially, must also be very extreme. That's a desire, I think. So in this sense, the definitions of world cultures have not moved much at all from the tiered hierarchy of cultures implicit in international organizations and prizes that require translation or submission into center languages, those being English, French, and German. And this seems to demand a level of tokenism that confirms pre-existing ideas of places and cultures. You can see this again by judging books by their covers or films by their thumbnails or DVD covers or whatever you want to use now. So this is from my Apple TV, the international section. This is the editor's picks, and I was surprised to find in the top 3 lines 3 Korean films, Burning, Mother, and Lady Vengeance. But you also see that there is a real interest in Korean women's faces that are kind of obscured or half turned. This is a very common trope in book covers as well. So here I have an example of Shin Kyung-suk's Please Look After Mom, 엄마를 부탁해, which was the first Korean language novel in translation to make it onto the New York Times bestseller list, and this was in 2011. This is a selection now of some of the foreign book covers for Shin Kyung-suk's book. The first is the Korean cover, which doesn't really show anything specific, I would say, about the novel, but that it has this kind of European painting, which is actually a Salvador Dali painting, which is a study on another French painting. But if you look at some of these other ones, you can especially see the preponderance of Korean female or Asian female faces, I would say. Many of them only in profile. We have a lot of traditional imagery. This bottom one here is the first English edition, the UK edition. You see again, like the kind of brush strokes, the Asian-y brush strokes, and this this decoration, this kind of tooling that looks pretty Asian-y. We have these women in hanbok here, woman with an umbrella, which I'm not sure is actually a Korean image, or this one with the teacup, which looks more Chinese. So there is this kind of idea that there's a desire of some sort of imagery from Korea that sometimes is modern and sometimes is very traditional, but is unclear. Yes. I would say too, it's often talked about in terms of a land of contrasts. We often hear about South Korea or Korea as a land of contrasts in the international media. It's a place of hyper modern daily life. It has the highest speed internet in the world. It has constant streams of information being delivered to people everywhere on domestically made smartphones. And it's also a nation with a deeply ingrained traditional culture. We can see this in so many of the representations of Korea that we get, popular or not. So in the, sorry, I got distracted by a question. in the literature, or in what we want to see from the literature, in the food, we want to see this kind of traditional setup or kind of court cuisine, as well as the newest street snacks and food fads or mukbang or any of these things. I think that the Korean industrial giants like Samsung and Hyundai have certainly had an effect on this shift in the perception of Korea as a technology powerhouse, but the cultural movements to preserve national culture or to aestheticize it through research into the arts and support for contemporary culture has also worked to create a coherent narrative of Korean culture that also coincides with commercial and political interests. And I would say in closing, sorry, is this, no, this is where I would like to close. The most important thing for thinking about Korean literature, film, and arts, especially as approaching a high culture aesthetic, is how these contrasting images of tradition and hypermodernity, or kind of cool Korea, are utilized to construct a narrative of cultural continuity that can take its place amongst the pantheon of elite world cultures as having always been, rather than being two distinct cultures that are that might have characterized Korean culture in the 20th century, traditional Korea and modernizing or westernized Korea. Because it is in that continuity that we can find the valorization of Korean culture and arts as really inherent to the culture, rather than having reconciled maybe two opposing ways of being. So I don't need to end on this very cynical note, but I would say that recognition for Korean literature and film as forms of representative global high culture really shows us how national cultures become global through careful management of their particularity within a recognized understanding of what this universal world culture is. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So thank you, Dr. Wang Medina, for the insightful talk. We will now entertain some of the questions that have been raised by the audience tonight. The first is, given the global recognition of K-culture, what or who do you think is the subject of this quote unquote technology of recognition, to borrow Shumeishu's term? Or in other words, who decides when K-culture becomes global and worldly? And how do you view the Korean filmmakers or entertainment companies' strategies of consciously appealing to the US market? Oh, you are muted, Jenny.
Sorry, that's a lot of questions in one question, but I will do my best to address this very rich foray into what I'm talking about. So who is the subject of this technology of recognition? I'm glad that the questioner brought up Shumei. I would say it's difficult to say because of how we want to approach this kind of world of Koreans. And this certainly has been a contested space for understanding who gets to be K, right? Certainly North Korea they don't call themselves Korea, so they call themselves Joseon, although their Romanized name does include Korea, right? But it's a shifting site, I would say, and it's interesting to think about who benefits from it, because on one hand, certainly South Korea benefits from it economically, right? And in terms of prestige. And this has been a South Korean effort in order to really spread the image of Korea. But that's not to say that Koreans in the diaspora have not benefited from this as well. So there is a kind of thinking about Korea's racialization and others, Korean people's racialization in other places through this kind of celebration of Korean culture as well. I would say particularly for the image of Korean and Asian American masculinity, or Korean and Asian masculinity. Like there's now an idea of like very good looking Asian men, which I would say in the 80s was not really considered much outside of Bruce Lee. Who decides? This is the question, right? Who does decide? There is this idea of the gatekeeping through prize culture and through various forms of recognition. But it seems to me too that South Korea has decided that they're going to do this, and they are doing it. Not to say that the artists have no agency in themselves, but this effort to promote Korean culture at all these different levels has really shown us that that it can be done commercially. It has worked for the literature as well, not just pumping money in, but really thoughtfully thinking, really thoughtfully approaching a way to share this culture and get recognition for it. Because that's not to say that not every country has great culture, but this has been quite successful, and who decides is it's kind of mutual. Who decides to really invest in it, maybe, and who decides to finally allow it. There is, of course, this kind of question of the economics of the investment, if the country is capable of that. Finally, the strategies to appeal to the US market. That has a lot to do with the long history between Korea and the US. And I would say that they don't only target the US market. Really, the Korean wave started in Asia, and it started as a regional kind of popularity, and then moves into other parts of the world. Certainly has always targeted the US as maybe the largest and most dominant like popular culture market. But particularly in literary translation, there have been efforts to branch out and to train translators who are fluent in other languages, and really to connect sites of minority literatures together. Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is, in the past weeks, as part of this webinar series, we've heard a lot about why Korean music has become popular in the US and what draws Americans to K-pop. Are there aspects or trends in Korean literature that can attract US audience?
Certainly talking about the disillusionment with daily life in a post-developmental society seems to have been gaining traction. There has been, I think, there has been a lot of interest in Korean genre fiction as well. So the initial investment was into high literary fiction and into like kind of defining the Korean national literary canon. But this has expanded, I think, in the same way that the film has with kind of genre ending and the kind of pastiche of genres into including parts of Korean literature that might not have been recognized as high literature in Korea, but is being recognized more for its literary value now, particularly like detective fiction, not detective, yeah, kind of thriller and horror adjacent literature. This kind of like seeks, and science fiction that kind of seeps into the grotesque, but is not quite just straight sci-fi. Sorry, was there another part of that question I didn't answer?
No, I think you would answer. Yeah, so the question was asking about, you know, trends that have been recently gaining traction among the American audience. So I think you did address that part of the question. Thank you. So the next question is, in your talk, Dr. Wang Medina, you asked about whether or not people outside of your bubble know about K-literature or K-film. I'm curious to know, how does one measure the impact of soft power through art or cultural exchange?
Well, someone has said before that the publishing industry really doesn't like metrics, but I would say I look at this very anecdotally. As a New Yorker, I look at what people are reading on the subway, and increasingly I see Korean literature in translation. Or you can kind of, if you want to just do this very unscientifically, films that get screened. For example, I saw Parasite in New York, Atlanta, and in Mexico City with my mother, which was kind of fun to read the subtitles in a different language. But I think those subtitles were probably based on Darcy Packett's subtitles, but still, there are ways that we can see this maybe through kind of personal interactions and how much it's appearing in your daily life. I would say something like, I don't know, I was standing with my uncle in Times Square several years ago, and he was looking up at the big screens, and he kind of got a tear in his eye, and I asked him what was wrong, and he said that he was looking at the screen. He said, it's made by LG. He said, the last time I was here was about 10 years ago, and it was a Sony screen. Oh. Now it's an LG screen. And he, you know, he really swelled with pride. But that's a very visual indicator that, you know, South Korea is doing something. I live near Barclays Center, and that's all Samsung, right?
Thank you. So another question is about on films, Korean films. I would like to hear your thoughts on the movie Okja by Bong Joon-ho. There are several Korean American jokes included in the movie, and the topic itself spans the story from America to Korea and back to America by the end. Do you think this is a good strategy for filmmakers to build virtual bridges between Koreans living abroad and Koreans living in Korea? And by the way, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative and insightful.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love the film Okja. A lot of people didn't like it, but it was also experimental for its platform, right? Which is something that Dr. Cho will talk about next time. But that it was premiered on Netflix. I think, I mean, film has always had international participation, right? But someone like Bong Joon-ho or Park Chan-wook now having the interest and the ability to get A-list stars to be in their films certainly does bridge audiences. Like Snowpiercer had Chris Evans in it, right? But I wonder if I would say that that was on the filmmaker's part a direct strategy to kind of globalize Korean cinema, or if he had a story he wanted to tell. The jokes about Korean Americans are fantastic because they really go over the head of people who are not Korean Americans or who are not Koreans, right? It also has a great part for translators, like inside jokes for translators, like never mistranslate the tattoo that Steve Young gets on his arm after mistranslating for, or misinterpreting actually for his organization. The role of Korean Americans in film and literature, and I would say food, has been very important because especially Korean Americans are visible in an American market. That's a way to, you know, show Korean faces in an American market that then makes it familiar so that it's not so jarring to see a Korean film all of a sudden. And to see them interacting, you know, with an international cast. I think that diaspora Koreans are very instrumental in the globalization of Korean culture.
Thank you. So in your discussion today, you talked about high culture, this concept of high culture. Could you talk about the implications of the Korean films that the Criterion Collection has chosen, which include The Housemaid, Secret Sunshine, and Parasite?
So the implications of these films?
Yeah. What is your, to rephrase the question a bit, how could you comment on the kinds of film or the criteria of this Criterion Collection, what these selections really imply with respect to this discussion of the high culture?
So I recently taught a Hong Sang-soo film in one of my classes, and the Korean students actually had said that they had never heard of they had heard of him because of his affair with Kim Min-hee, but didn't know, they had heard the name but had never seen any of his films. And I would say the same about many films that get international recognition. Certainly The Housemaid, young Koreans probably have never seen that. But that would be the same for a lot of auteur film and Criterion Collection film from any country, I would think, because it's not popular. So what do I think about the selection? I love those three films. So I would say that they're great, but are they representative? I think that certainly they have had a huge impact on Korean cinema and the history of Korean cinema. So certainly, yes. But on the other hand, there is this kind of thing about Korean people themselves not recognizing these things that have become the representative works of Korean high culture, especially the literature. If you look at any bestseller list in Korea, more books are foreign books than are Korean.
The next question is about, in your talk today, you mentioned the cultural core of English, French, and German, as well as watching Parasite in Mexico City. Do you note any differences in how different cultural core countries interact with Korean high literature and cinema?
Yes, and this sometimes has to do with the translators themselves, or maybe if I were to, when I was showing you the images of different book covers, there is often a kind of culturally specific difference about what about the images that are being used. For example, one of the book covers I showed of Please Look After Mom had like a woman holding a Japanese umbrella. So in that case, it's a country, I think that was the Bulgarian cover maybe. This is a place where maybe they don't know or they don't care about the difference between Japan and Korea. Whereas in the US, that would probably not fly. Sorry, I lost the thread of the question. Can you repeat it, please, Dr. Huang?
Yeah, one second. So you mentioned watching Parasite in Mexico City, the cultural core of English, French, and German. Are there any differences in how different countries interact with Korean high literature and cinema?
Yes, there are also within Korea, great translators who do the work of being a cultural ambassador to another country. So in France, for example, Korean literature in French has been hugely helped by the novelist Chae Yoon, who is herself a French literature professor, and it had been very developed there. But the things that were translated into French were not necessarily as what is interesting to American audiences.
Mm-hmm.
So there's certainly a different taste for each space.
Mm-hmm.
Kim has Empire of Lights, for example, was very successful in the US because it was called Your Republic is Calling You in the US, but it has to do with North Korea, so it was especially popular. And certainly those things have to be taken into account, but oftentimes I think that the translators themselves are more knowledgeable about how to approach a different market.
Thank you. So the next few questions I think are going to pertain more closely to Korean literature and translation. So could you, Dr. Wang Medina, discuss a little bit about why Pachinko gained so much popularity in the US, and what was the reaction to that in South Korea?
This is a good question. I loved Pachinko. It's a fabulous novel. I love Min Jin Lee. Why was it so popular in the US? This is the story of, it's the story of a multi-generational family that's very transnational. And it's a Korea that people are not familiar with in the US. Americans know about Korean American stories. We've been reading them for a long time, or at least since the 80s, right? But somehow this story of Zainichi Koreans was much more titillating, perhaps, or it shows a different side of the kind of transnational movement of not just Koreans, but families. And of course, she's a wonderful writer, so it's very popular, but it's also, I think, was very interesting to American readers because of the clear difference that gets made between amongst racialization in Asia, where in the US, non-Asians don't see different Asian ethnicities as different, right? Even in this kind of current election moment, Asians and many other groups are lumped under all others besides Black, white, and Latinx, right? We're all others. But reading something like Pachinko really, and this comes, I think, Min Jin Lee also spent time, she lived in Japan for quite some time. there is a different interaction that that is not centered on the American perception of race, which I think was very interesting to American readers. What was the reaction in South Korea? I'm not exactly sure. It became very popular when it was translated into Korean, and it became very popular once it won awards. It won the National Book Award, right? And once it won that award, Min Jin Lee became a Korean author, whereas before she was Korean American. I think one of the last languages it was translated into was Japanese, because in Japan too, people were confused about why the international audience, or why the American audience in particular, would be interested in reading about Zainichi Koreans.
Yeah. Thank you. The next question. The audience is saying, I like how you pointed out that in this realm of literature and film, visibility is one thing, but recognition is another. Of course, given that recognition leads to even more visibility, where do you think Korean film especially is headed, given the recognition that Parasite received this year? Could you see this increased visibility of Korean film and literature reaching people outside of this so-called bubble that you mentioned?
Well, I think Parasite really did. Right? The success of Parasite was really everywhere, but you can see this in a lot of different platforms. I showed the kind of the 3 top international, or like editors' picks for international films. This is not just because Korean film has gained recognition. This is also a business thing where there have been multiple deals with platforms like Netflix, or with Kdramas, or things like Viki, Rakuten, all these internet platforms, or these streaming services where you can find Korean products, right? Korean cultural products. Particularly with, say, Samsung televisions, they have that Korea TV like app. You can just kind of find something Korean. So there is that visibility. And now there might be more interest because people have heard, like, oh yeah, everybody was talking about that Korean film. It leads into some sort of space where there is an interest, right?
The next question is from a published Korean American young adult and children's book author. And he or she wants to ask, do you have any thoughts on the explosion of Asian American and especially Korean American youth literature, especially in contemporary romance, fantasy, and nonfiction?
Is this author Linda Sue Park? Or is it
I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have disclosed that. But, yeah.
Okay, because if it was,
I'll try to figure out after the event tonight. Yeah.
Because if it is, or I would like to say thank you because my children love her books. But where do I think this is going? Geez, I think it's very heartening for Asian American children, and it's so important for the representation, to see that representation and to see things like it in young adult romance in particular, that Asian Americans can be romantic instead of just studying. Like, it's really breaking down stereotypes in a very important way, that a lot of this is doing. Film and literature and all of this kind of representation is showing that it's not a binary representation of cool or romantic or masculine or feminine, right? This kind of shows the spectrum of not only well, it just shows a broader spectrum of what's possible in, I guess, American literature. And where is it going? I don't know, but I'm happy about it. And I'm grateful to all these authors.
Oh, and I think she is a friend of Linda Sue Park. So the person okay, so next question is Could you speak more about how Korean literature seeks to recognize the post-1980s Korean individual who is grappling with government or state oppression? How, for example, Hangang's Human Acts is either representative or not of attempts to reconcile the trauma of the past in the present?
Wow, that's a very difficult question, a very good question. How does Korean literature deal with it? I mean, the resonances of the 1980s democratization movement and of the traumas that occurred during the 80s have resonated through all of much of this literature and film, right? Bong Joon-ho himself talks about this. He was a student activist, and student activist or like former activist figure in most of his films, right? There is, again, a disillusionment with where Korea has come, at the same time that there is an appropriation of that narrative of democratization now as a celebratory thing for Korean national identity, South Korean culture. It's become part of Korean culture, this history of protest.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it's become culturalized. The culture of protest has become very institutionalized in a way. You can see this if you see Korean protests in Korea now. They always have really beautiful signs, and it's very well organized. It is quite aesthetically pleasing, right? In ways that I think have come from the way that South Korea is now like dealing with its contentious past.
Mm-hmm. Next one, as a literary translator yourself, could you speak to the kinds of dilemmas, concerns, or issues you encounter when translating from one literary language to another?
Sure. And I would say this too, in connection with Korean American literature or Asian American writers. In translation, there's always this fear of including like untranslatable things or including Korean words in like Romanized Korean words. Whereas I find with hyphenated American writers, they don't have a problem with that. They'll just put it in there and figure and assume that and force it, or not force it, I guess, but insist that the reader figure it out or deal with it, right? Like ondol or something like this. I was talking to one of my students about this very recently. Ondol is the heated floors. How do you explain that in a translation without a footnote? There are ways to do it. But do you just call it a heated floor, or do you call it like a system of flues that have heated floors for thousands of years? No. These are problems that every translator deals with, and it's always a personal choice. I myself, I think even now there's been some argument over whether or not to italicize Romanized Korean words, whether or not to like switch the order of the names, these sorts of things. That again comes to personal choice, and sometimes it really has to do with how the narrative is constructed around it and how the language around it can support or not support it.
Next question is, are voices in Korean literature being heard over America's tendency to overlay Korean culture with Chinese and Japanese cultures? It seems that America projects perceptions of Chinese and Japanese culture onto Korean culture. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes and no. I think for sure in the past that was much more the case. As in someone asking, oh, when I was a child, I often got asked what knees I was. I was not a knees because I'm Korean or I'm Korean American. But I mean, gosh, this is a tough question to answer. As Korea becomes more visible, I think this is the fact that K-anything exists is because J something existed before, right? Because of J-pop. So there will always be the comparison, and that has to do, again, I think, with American racialization of Asian people. If you have that huge of a category, there's going to be a loss of specificity. And you can see this too. I teach this all the time in my food class, where you can have an Asian restaurant and it will have everything from like pad thai to kimbap to, you know, I don't know, pho, whatever. Like it's all mixed in, and that is problematic in the same way that it is becoming more discrete in that there is more access to the particular cultures, right? And the diasporas of those cultures also have access to the contemporary culture. So where there is more exchange, and with that exchange, there comes more specificity. I hope, at least.
Yes, we all hope.
Yeah. Although my daughter did say that someone told her that she was from Chinatown in her class. And that's very specific to New York, but or to a big city. But
Okay. So next question. Beyond literary works, how much translation is being done of Korean nonfiction works, especially in the areas of history and politics or sociology, cultural studies, gender studies, and so on?
not enough, I would say, not enough. But there are, I guess, more recently, but it is difficult to get funding for that kind of, for nonfiction translation. There is a different sphere of, or there is now a category of literary nonfiction that has been getting some support, and the LTI Korea does support that. But this is not really my realm of expertise. There are professional translators who work in nonfiction, and especially manuals. I would say that's a big thing. Video games actually is a space for a lot of translation because of the popularity of Korean esports. So this is another space, and then there's also a lot of fan translation. So I would say that if you look at something like webtoons, or if you look at fanfic, that gets translated rapidly and pretty well by users. And this is another space for the kind of growth that we're seeing with Korean popular culture.
Okay, so this will be the last question of the evening. What is the role of translation when it comes to branding Korean literature as world literature?
The role of translation should not be underplayed. It's huge. Without translation, it couldn't have been world literature because no one would read it. There aren't enough Korean speakers in the world. Literature and translation, or translation has, and the focus on translation has really made people interested in it, not just from the books that are available, but from the way that I think that Korea has focused on several aspects of its culture to share, not just something that makes money. The fact that Korea has invested in literature, and it is not profitable, right? Literary fiction is not super profitable, particularly something like poetry, not profitable, but there is interest, and people are starting to be interested because, and it's becoming recognized because there has been investment in it. And this is mostly what this is, really the point of what I'm talking about, that Korea did decide that it was going to do a holistic investment into recognition of Korean culture, not just the things that were going to make money, but the things that were also going to provide a broader picture of what Korean culture really is and what it has been historically.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Ring Medina, for your illuminating talk and discussion today. And thank you to all of you in audience today for attending this session and for raising insightful questions. Please join us for the fourth and final event of our webinar series 2 weeks from now on November 19th at the same time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. This last talk will be concerning Korean television dramas or Kdramas and their rising popularity in today's global media landscape. Thank you again, both Dr. Wayne Medina and the audience for your attendance tonight. And I hope everyone have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your great questions. And thank you, Dr. Huang.